attack.
Rinvoq can lower your ability.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day. We're coming on the air with breaking news about Bill Cosby. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court has overturned the 83-year-old actor's sex assault conviction, and he could be released from prison within hours. Cosby served more than 2 years of a 3 to 10-year sentence, convicted of drugging and molesting Temple University employee Andrea Constant. Ron Allen has been covering this case from the very beginning. Ron, why was the conviction vacated?
Throughout this entire process, Cosby had complained that the other accusers, other than Andrea Constant, were allowed to testify at his trial. You'll remember the first trial ended in a deadlocked hung jury. One woman was allowed to testify. In the second trial, there were 5 other so-called prior bad acts that were explored by the prosecutors. 5 other women who had accused him of similar sexual assault. The prosecutors justified this by saying that they were trying to show that there was a pattern, that he had treated women the same way, that he essentially had befriended or become a mentor for some young performers and then started seeing them, and then at some point this became a romantic relationship, and that he allegedly drugged them and sexually assaulted them in some way. The Supreme Court is now saying that that's unfair, essentially, to have these other witnesses testify. This is central to many cases that have been part of the MeToo movement. The Harvey Weinstein case, there were 4 other women who were allowed to testify in his case as well. So while this pertains to only the case of Bill Cosby in Pennsylvania, it could have far-reaching implications, because the basic principle here that Cosby argued, and apparently successfully, before the Supreme Court, is that he should have been tried only based on what happened in the Andrea Constance matter that was before the court. That the jury could not and should not have heard other testimony from other women about other things that he had done. There was also a deposition that had been sealed as a result of a civil suit that Constance had brought against Cosby. The judge in the criminal case against Cosby allowed that deposition to be unsealed, even though there was an agreement, Cosby maintained, with the prior prosecutor that it would remain confidential and secret. So basically, Cosby's argument throughout this whole thing has been he wasn't treated fairly, that he was that other witnesses were allowed to testify that didn't pertain to this particular case. And it appears, I'm still reading through the decision, through the opinions, but it appears the Supreme Court agreed with that basic principle.
All right, Ron Allen, thank you. I want to turn now to NBC legal analyst Danny Savalas. Danny, does this open the door for a retrial, or what potentially happens now?
It does. I'm still poring over this opinion, Lester. It's multiple pages, and getting through it, and I'm seeing that the court didn't even address the 404B issue, which is the witnesses, the prior bad acts witnesses. But it appears that the Commonwealth, and that's the state of Pennsylvania, would be able to try Cosby again if they so elected. So this is a massive win. I can tell you, of handling many appeals in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that they are not easy to win, that this is a very rare event to have your entire conviction vacated like this or overturned. And so it'll be interesting to see what strategically the Commonwealth does going forward.
There was also some questions at the beginning of this case about prior agreements with the prior DA. Did that come into play here?
It did. It is something that is discussed. I haven't read the court-specific ruling on it, but it appears that that is one of the bases on appeal. And essentially the argument was that it appears that Bruce Castor, the prior DA, made some kind of unofficial deal where allegedly that Cosby would agree to take a deposition and possibly get a civil settlement for one of the victims. And in exchange, at least Cosby argued, there would be no prosecution. Whether or not or how much of that is true, I'm not entirely sure, but that was a main basis for appeal, essentially that Cosby was already essentially immune because of an agreement, allegedly, with the prior prosecutor.
Is there anything here that questions any of the facts of the case as we've known them?
Nothing I've seen so far, Lester, but I caution that this is hot off the presses, and I'm still scrolling through this this opinion as I can right now. All
right, I want to let you get back to that. Danny, thanks. NBC's Kate Snow joins me on the telephone. Kate, you had the first interview with his accuser, Andrea Constant, back in 2018. This obviously is going to reverberate with her and many of Cosby's other accusers. Have you heard from them, or do you have a sense of the reaction?
Yeah, Lester, I'm actually texting people as we speak, and so far getting responses like, oh my God, I'm sick to my stomach. I don't know what to make of this. I have not heard from Andrea Constant herself yet. I did reach out to her. Haven't heard anything from her, but I can tell you from interviewing her and doing a group interview for Dateline several years ago where we had many accusers, over 20 accusers in one room of Bill Cosby telling their stories, that this will be earth-shattering for them. This is exactly what they were hoping against all hope would not happen. And, you know, going into this appeal, they were obviously fully aware that the appeal was ongoing, but I think there was a sense that this would hold up, that this, you know, the decision of the court would stand and that it would not win on appeal. So I think there's a shock, there's a sense of frustration, and as time goes on today, I'm sure they'll all be absorbing this. I'm hearing from people that they can't even process right now what they're hearing because they really just didn't expect this, Lester.
Yeah, and as we heard, I mean, part of the question or part of the point of the appeal was the reliance of testimony of some of the other women who ultimately told very similar stories. What did it take for many of them to come forward and to sign on and agree to testify?
Yeah, if you think back in time to when this all really came to a head, it was one woman writing a piece in the Washington Post at first, and then it was another coming forward, and sort of a drip of women feeling empowered enough now that there were some people speaking out to join in and join the chorus and say, this is my experience too. This didn't happen all at once. It took time, played out over months, and that group interview that I just told you about, reminded you about, that was something that took months for us to arrange. So this was a very, very difficult thing for these women to share, often 20, 30-year-old memories that they said they had of being assaulted by Bill Cosby. So, it was traumatic for them to relive it. I think today is going to be another traumatic day for women who say they are survivors and will continue to say they are survivors of mistreatment by Bill Cosby.
All right. Kate, we'll ask you to stand by. I want to go back to our legal analyst, Danny Savalos, who is literally poring over this decision. What else have you gleaned from it so far, Danny?
Well, it looks like my early reading was right in that the Supreme Court focused primarily on Cosby's giving up of his Fifth Amendment rights. And he did that based on what the court concluded was his reasonable reliance on the former district attorney, Bruce Castor's, assurances that if, hey, you go do this deposition in a civil case, which will lead to a settlement or money given to the victim, I understand you're giving up your Fifth Amendment right. Because, Lester, anytime you have a client who's being charged and sued, you never let them take a deposition or sit for a deposition because they may lose their Fifth Amendment privilege or give it up unnecessarily. So that's exactly what the Supreme Court said, that when Bill Cosby did that, when he went to give that deposition in a civil case, he gave up his Fifth Amendment rights, and he did so relying on the assurances of the prosecutor that, hey, we're never going to prosecute you if you just do this deposition. And then, lo and behold, many years later, this deposition comes back and is used against him. His own words are used against him in violation of due process, and the court said the Fifth Amendment.
I'm trying to dig back in my memory. Wasn't this an issue at the outset that the Cosby team was hoping to avoid a trial, raising this issue of that deal?
Absolutely. And in doing so, they did the most important thing you can do on appeal, Lester, and that is make a record. It would have been a much harder climb if they hadn't spotted this issue at the trial level, put it in the record, and then preserved it for the appellate court. Because any appellate lawyer will tell you, if you're raising an issue for the first time on appeal, good luck. The standard is much higher in that situation. But Cosby's team raised it. They may have lost it. No surprise. A trial judge is very reluctant to throw a prosecution's case out unless he or she absolutely has to. But they preserved it for appeal. And on appeal, they were actually victorious on this issue. Again, a very rare moment in appeals land.
Obviously, the prosecution has a lot to think over right now. You mentioned there's always a possibility of another trial. But in practicality, given the amount of time he has already served on the conviction now tossed out, how likely is it, in your view, that we would see another trial?
A prosecutor at this stage has to take into account not only the fact there have been 2 trials already, but that Cosby has already served some time in prison. They have to take a realistic assessment and balance whatever political benefit there is from prosecuting Cosby, whatever symbolic benefit, against the waste or the use of resources, prosecutorial, investigative resources, in re-prosecuting Cosby. Sometimes, and this is from the words of a biased defense attorney, it can come down to ego alone. So you hope that clear minds prevail and the prosecutors take into account the resources that would be required to re-prosecute someone. If they're not entirely sure, they can get a conviction again. And remember, the first trial, they did not get a conviction. Right now, they're arguably 0 for 2.
All right, Danny, thank you. Let me go back to Ron Allen right now. As we noted, had covered this case at the time. You were there, in fact, the day that he left for prison, or the day he was convicted.
I was, Lester, and just on the last point that you were making about retrialing, I'll never forget a ride I had with a cab driver to the court one day who was a resident of the area right where the Montgomery County Court is located, an area that's very urban, shall we say. And he was very upset about the fact that Cosby was being retried and wondered why isn't there more money and resources being devoted to fighting crime in this community and to prosecuting other kinds of cases that were more relevant to the people who live there. So that's one reaction I think you will hear in some of the areas near the courthouse in urban America where they think there are other priorities than re-prosecuting Bill Cosby based on something that happened so long ago. Yes, I was there when he was convicted, and there was a huge outpouring of just disbelief and relief from the women who had gathered there, so many survivors. It was a pouring rain that day, and they were coming out one by one saying how this was so monumental, that this was something that, just remember who Bill Cosby was before all this, America's dad, Cliff Huxtable. He seemed invincible. He seemed like he could not be brought down, and the evidence against him seemed so compelling to anybody who would read it. And these women just felt that they had accomplished so much. I can only imagine that they are going to be so heartbroken today and worried about the precedent that this sets. Again, this is just the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, but the basic principle seems to be, as Cosby argued, that his trial was not fair because it was about more than just the case, the accuser before him then, that there were other women allowed to testify about things that he had allegedly done years and years ago. And if that's the basic principle that the court is deciding this on, that has repercussions, I would think, in many other places. This whole idea of prior bad actor and looking at other witnesses' testimony, in a legal sense, as I understand it, it was very narrowly defined, and the judge in this case allowed these witnesses. It was also an odd thing that, again, in the first trial, only one other woman testified. In the second case, there were 5, and there was never a clear explanation as to why 5, 10. The number was never really explained by the judge, and we could never find an answer as to what was the reasoning behind this. It seemed, frankly, a bit arbitrary, and that's what Cosby's lawyers had argued, that this was arbitrary, that they were allowing this testimony. And again, now it seems that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has agreed to that basic principle, and I would think that all the women who so bravely and with so much courage came forward years and years later to face this seemingly invincible individual are just going to be devastated and heartbroken that this has happened now.
Yeah, and Ron, let me use that to transition to our colleague Kate Snow right now, who remains on the phone with us. Kate, how is this seen now through the lens of the MeToo movement?
Yeah, you know, the women who accused Bill Cosby saw themselves as the beginning of that movement. Because remember, it happened a couple of years before the Harvey Weinstein case and all of the other famous Me Too cases that we've seen since. So they really saw themselves at the forefront, Lester. And I remember, it sticks with me, that Beverly Johnson, who's a famous supermodel who has made accusations against Bill Cosby, she said to me in that group interview that we did with many, many accusers, she said, "We're moving the needle. We may not be moving it much, but we're moving the needle." That was the sense that this group had, was that in prosecuting Bill Cosby to begin with, even having that second trial was a landmark for them. And then the conviction, as Ron was just saying, was a moment of release and relief for not just those women, but I think many, many women who have made allegations against powerful people of sexual assault. And they felt like it was sort of a new beginning. So what I'm getting now from people, Lester, as we speak, I'm getting text messages from many of the women who accused Bill Cosby who are saying, this feels like a punch in the gut. This feels like a reversal of all the work that they had done. Now, this is not a legal comment. Obviously, you're hearing why this appeal was held up by the court, but they did not expect this. They felt like public opinion, the court of public opinion, has been on their side, and they felt that they had proven their case in terms of the court of public opinion, Lester.
All right, Kate Snow, thanks very much. If you're just joining us again, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has vacated the conviction of comedian actor Bill Cosby. Let me go to Pete Williams right now, our justice correspondent in Washington. Pete, you've got a little more information from the Supreme Court and perhaps what happens next in all this.
Right. In terms of what happens next, Lester, under this court ruling, Bill Cosby cannot be tried again on these charges. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court's order explicitly says no retrial on these charges. Now, obviously, if other women are to come forward and there would be new charges filed, that's another matter. But he can't face trial again on these charges.
All right, Pete. Danny Savelis, our legal analyst, is standing by right now. Danny, how will this decision be viewed in the legal community? Was this a strong case for a reversal?
This may not be a popular opinion, but at the outset, these were some pretty decent grounds for appeal. Frankly, I was surprised the court didn't even really reach the issue of what's called 404B evidence, the prior bad act, because in the first trial, the court let in one prior bad act witness, that's somebody who essentially testifies he did something like this before. Then in the second trial, they let in a bunch more without any real explanation. I thought that was an issue for appeal. And then this argument that Cosby was relying on the assurances of Bruce Castor's promise that he would be free, immune, if he testified in a civil case. So not a huge surprise, but generally a surprise because appeals are so rarely successful, no matter how strong your issue is.
And for those of us not familiar with the law, essentially vacating means as if this trial never happened.
Yeah, vacating the conviction. That's right.
Yeah,
yes,
sorry,
but as Pete pointed out, and as you know, I'm going through this opinion as we speak. It is true, Pete is right, that there will be no retrial on these specific charges. And now you have to understand that I believe the statute of limitations for these charges was 12 years. Cosby was arrested just days before that original statute expired. So the window or the opportunity for bringing any new charges for any new possible victims is very, very small indeed, if not vanishing.
So they would need essentially a new victim, a new claim, a new charge to go forward.
A newer incident, something that happened more recently, or in the case of, say, a conspiracy, a last date of an act in which the conspiracy was covered up, for example, that happened sometime within the statute of limitations. But that may be very difficult to do.
And Kate Snow, as we noted, has been in contact with some of the women who had come forward in this case. And Kate, did anyone see this potential? I know you haven't had a lot of conversations yet, but any sense that anyone saw this coming, that this was an area of the law that maybe he could get off?
No, the sense in the group, Lester, and I've kept in touch with people, over these years since the conviction, the sense was that this was an appeal that would fail. Clearly, they were wrong. I'm going to read you a couple of things if I can, Lester, and I'm going to have to put you on speaker for a second so that I can read my text messages. I just got a statement from Eden Turrell. She's one of the accusers of Bill Cosby. She says, from the very beginning, the rigid constructs of the statute of limitations did not provide protection or a pathway for justice for the women that came out against Cosby. The outdated laws are so clearly in place, protecting men in these cases more often than not. This is the story of the MeToo movement that must be included in the narrative now. Enough pushing the Cosby story off to the side. I am completely out of breath. That's a text message that I just got from Eden Turl. I also got one from Heidi Thomas, another accuser, saying, when I asked, did you expect this at all with any indication? She said, not at all, out of the blue. He was just refused parole for not taking part in sex assault programs. I don't know if that's factually accurate. I haven't been able to fact check that. But those are the kind of sentiments, Lester, that I'm hearing from these women. And again, I have reached out to Andrea Constant, the primary accuser whose case led to his conviction, and have not heard back yet, Lester.
Yeah, and who knows if there would be solace in at least the knowledge that this court decision does not address the specific facts of the case.
Well, that may be some solace, that this is really, as it's been described by Danny, a very legally founded appeal. I mean, this is something that, in terms of the law, the court is saying is not was not permissible, having those 5 women give their supporting testimony. But as you say, they're not saying that testimony was inaccurate.
Yeah, and just to go back, I recall that interview, of course, you did for Dateline. It was stunning. And I mean, what struck you in terms of their stories and how they meshed?
Yeah, Lester, what was so striking sitting and talking to, number one, many of those women at the time that we did that interview had not met before. They had never known each other. And so to have them sit together and one at a time say very similar things, they, almost to a person, talked about what many would describe as grooming, ways that Bill Cosby befriended them and took them under his wing, promised them things. Many of them were aspiring actresses or models who said that he had promised them attention and access to Hollywood, to movie sets, to TV sets, appearances on the Cosby Show, those kind of moments. And to these women at the time, this is often 20, 30 years ago, these were very important promises, but they now see that as what they call grooming, where he gained their confidence and then, slowly but surely took the friendship to a different level and, in their words, abused and assaulted them. So that was the most striking thing, was the parallels and the consistencies in their stories. And that's exactly why the prosecutor wanted supporting witnesses to speak during the second trial. He wanted those 5 women to essentially say, this is a pattern. This is a pattern of practice. This is not a one-off what happened to Andrea Constant. It's something that happened repeatedly. But now with this appeal, we'll have to see, legally speaking, what happens next. Again, the women that I'm talking to are dumbfounded by this.
All right, Kate Snow, we thank you very much. And so the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania has made its decision, and Bill Cosby could leave prison at any time. We're going to have much more on this story tonight on NBC Nightly News. For now, I'm Lester Holt, NBC News, New York. Good day.
We now join our regularly scheduled program already in progress.
Well, I'm glad you're happy.